Welcome back to CleanTech Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're diving into something pretty significant happening in the world of global shipping. The International Maritime Organization, the IMO, they've got this new net zero framework. It's a huge plan aimed at decarbonizing the entire sector.
It really is ambitious, a major undertaking.
But as we often find when you get into the details, especially defining what actually counts as a green fuel, well, that's where the controversy starts brewing.
Absolutely. The definition is key, and it's proving complex.
So for this deep dive, we've looked at the IMO's own documents, some EU regulations which are quite relevant, and reactions from different players. Our mission today is really to unpack this new framework.
And explore those complexities, yeah. Figure out what's going on with these sustainable fuels in the maritime world.
Exactly. So this net zero framework, it just got approved, right, this April.
That's right. At the MEPC 83 meeting, the Marine Environment Protection Committee, it's set to become a whole new chapter in MARPOL Annex 6.
MARPOL Annex is it? That's the big international agreement on ship pollution, isn't it?
It is, the main one for air pollution. And the timeline here is, well, quite fast. They're aiming for formal adoption at a special MEPC session this October.
October 2025.
And then potentially it could enter into force just 16 months after that.
Wow. So maybe early 2027, roughly?
Huh.
That is quick for international regulations.
It is, assuming everything stays on track, of course.
Okay, let's get into the framework itself. You mentioned unpacking it. What are the sort of core pieces we need to understand?
Fundamentally, it's built on two main pillars.
Okay.
The first is what they call a goal-based marine fuel standard.
Goal-based, meaning?
Meaning it doesn't initially dictate specific fuels. Instead, it sets a target, a trajectory, for gradually reducing the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuels ships use.
Ah, I see. So it's like setting the target lower emissions intensity, but giving the industry some leeway on how they achieve that reduction.
Precisely. It encourages innovation, looking at different fuel types, different technologies. It sets the direction of travel.
Okay, that makes sense. Flexibility within a clear goal. What's the second pillar? You mentioned an economic aspect.
Yes, the second pillar is an economic element, specifically a pricing mechanism for maritime GHG emissions.
A carbon price for shipping.
Essentially, yes. The draft that got approved includes this structure. I think it's a $100 fee per metric ton of CO2 equivalent emissions above a certain threshold.
Okay.
But then, significantly, that fee jumps up to $380 per ton if emissions go beyond an even higher threshold.
Right, so a tiered system.
Yeah.
A pretty steep increase at that higher level.
Definitely. It puts a real financial weight on using higher emitting fuels. And alongside this price, there's also a plan for a system to earn and trade carbon credits.
Ah, okay, so a cap and trade element, sort of market-based incentives.
Exactly. It introduces that market dynamic to encourage going beyond the minimum requirements.
This combination seems quite potent. A performance standard for the fuel's GHG intensity, plus this carbon pricing mechanism. How does this fit into the IMO's overall climate goals?
It's designed specifically to push the industry towards the targets set out in the 2023 IMO GHG strategy. That strategy was a big step up in ambition.
Right, I remember that. It had some specific near-term goals too, didn't it?
It did. It calls for zero or near zero emission technologies, fuels, or energy sources to make up at least 5% and ideally 10% of the energy used by international shipping by 2030.
So this framework with the fuel standard and the pricing is the tool to actually drive that uptake of cleaner options by 2030.
That's the idea, yes. It provides the regulatory push and the economic signals needed to start making that shift happen.
Now, with any big international climate agreement, you always get differing views, resistance sometimes. I understand some small island states weren't entirely happy.
That's a really crucial point, yes. There was significant pushback, particularly from nations like the Marshall Islands.
What were their main concerns?
Their representative, Hilton Kendall, was quite outspoken. They felt the compromise didn't go far enough or wasn't structured correctly. They had been pushing hard for a simpler, flat carbon tax, I think around $150 per ton.
A flat tax instead of the tiered system. Why?
Their core concern was about equity. They worried that the tiered system, as designed, could allow wealthier nations to essentially pay their way out or shift the financial burden of the transition onto developing countries, including vulnerable island states.
I see. The fear that richer countries could just absorb the lower tier costs while the higher tier, which might hit everyone harder, isn't strong enough initially.
Something like that, yes. And Kendall really framed it starkly, saying they were fighting not just for economic interest, but for the safety of their people, their homes. It highlights that fundamental tension in global climate policy, balancing ambition with fairness and equity.
Absolutely. A
Okay.
tough balancing act. Okay, so the IMO has set the stage. Fuel standards, carbon pricing. But the big question hanging over all this, the one causing sparks, is what are these green fuels? What qualifies?
You've nailed it. That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? And it's far from simple. A really good place to look for parallels and maybe some foreshadowing is the aviation sector.
Sustainable aviation fuels, or SLAF.
Exactly. The debates happening there around S, particularly in Europe with the Refuel EU aviation regulation, they really mirror the challenges facing maritime. Same kinds of fuels, similar sustainability questions.
Okay, tell us about that Refuel EU aviation situation. I saw something about a legal challenge.
Yes, there was. The European Biofuels Group, EPRE, along with a producer called Pannonia Bio, they challenged the regulation in court.
On what grounds?
Their core argument was that the regulation unfairly discriminates against S made from food and feed crops, basically crop-based biofuels.
Discriminated how? By excluding them or limiting their use?
Pretty much, yeah. By not allowing them to count fully towards the mandates or setting stricter limits compared to other types of S, like those made from waste or residues. Now, technically, their case was dismissed. Yeah, on procedural grounds. The court said they didn't have the legal standing to bring the challenge directly, but the substance of their argument is still out there.
Which is that this alleged bias hurts their industry.
Yes, it harms the producers of crop-based biofuels, they argue, and it limits the overall supply of lower carbon fuels available to the aviation sector. Interestingly, some U.S. biofuel groups actually joined in support of the European challenge.
Really? But which one?
Groups like the Renewable Fuels Association, Growth Energy, the U.S. Grains Council, even LanzaJet, which works on alcohol-to-jet fuel. They filed arguments saying the EU rule has effects beyond Europe, basically restricting market access for their products, too.
So, extraterritorial effects, they
Right.
claim. That's fascinating. And the connection to shipping is, if this is happening in aviation,
It's highly probable we'll see very similar debates, similar restrictions, maybe similar legal fights
Yeah.
when it comes to using crop-based biofuels in ships.
Hmm.
The underlying issues, land use, food versus fuel, actual GHG savings are the same.
right, it sets a precedent, or at least signals the direction regulators might take. So let's look closer at the EU's general rules. This Renewable Energy Directive, RED, I think it's called, what does that say about biofuels overall?
The RED, specifically Directive 2018-2001, is really the foundation for the EU's approach. It lays out sustainability and greenhouse gas saving criteria that all biofuels, bioliquids, and biomass fuels must meet to count towards renewable targets.
And what are those criteria focused on?
A key focus is preventing harm to biodiversity and natural resources. So fuels can't be sourced from land with high biodiversity value, like primary forests, or from high carbon stock areas like wetlands or peatlands.
Makes sense. Protect valuable ecosystems.
Exactly. And critically, it addresses the food versus fuel issue you mentioned. There are specific limits on how much biofuels made from food and feed crops can contribute to renewable energy targets, especially in transport.
What kind of limits?
Generally, the contribution from these crop-based fuels is capped. It can't be more than 1 percentage point higher than the country's 2020 level, and overall, it can't exceed 7% of final energy consumption in road and rail transport.
So a definite ceiling on conventional biofuels.
Yes, and there are even stricter rules for biofuels identified as having a high risk of causing indirect land use change, or ILUC.
ILUC. That's when growing biofuel crops displaces food crops, pushing agriculture onto previously uncultivated land, like forests, right? Which can release a lot of carbon.
Precisely. The EU wants to phase out support for high ILUC risk fuels, like palm oil was a major one discussed. The directive is trying to steer investment towards advanced biofuels, things made from waste, residues, non-food crops.
Okay. And how does it measure the GHG savings? Does it treat all biofuels the same?
No, definitely not. That's another key point. The RD includes detailed methodologies and even default values for GHG emission savings for different biofuel pathways.
For example?
Well, the annexes list typical savings compared to fossil fuels. For instance, ethanol made from sugar beet might have a higher default saving than ethanol from corn. Biodiesel from used cooking oil typically shows much, much higher savings than biodiesel from, say, grapeseed oil.
So the feedstock and the production process matter hugely for the actual climate benefit.
Absolutely. And the directive clearly favors pathways with higher GHG savings, particularly those using waste and residues, which often have very low life cycle emissions attributed to them.
What about biomass from forests? Wood pellets, that kind of thing. Are there rules for that too?
Yes, there are specific sustainability criteria for forest biomass as well. They cover things like ensuring the harvesting is legal, forests are regenerated, sensitive areas are protected, and that using biomass doesn't harm soil quality, biodiversity, or the forest's long-term ability to produce timber.
It sounds incredibly detailed.
It is. And it relies heavily on certification schemes, voluntary schemes that are recognized by the EU to verify that these criteria are being met. There's also a strong emphasis on transparency and traceability, using things like mass balance systems.
Right, so you can track the sustainable molecules through the supply chain, even if they get mixed with non-sustainable ones.
That's the principle, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's complex, but it's the EU's attempt to ensure that when they promote renewable fuels, they're actually getting the environmental benefits they expect without causing other problems.
It really sets the stage for the kind scrutiny we can expect for marine fuels under the IMO framework, doesn't it? The definition of sustainable or green is going to be rigorously debated based on these kinds of life cycle assessments.
I think that's almost certain. The pressure will be immense to adopt similarly robust criteria.
Okay, so biofuels are complex. What about other contenders for greener shipping? What else is being seriously looked at?
Well, beyond biofuels, there's a lot of focus on ammonia and methanol, particularly green ammonia and green methanol.
Green meaning produced using renewable electricity.
Exactly. Using electrolysis powered by wind or solar, for example, to produce hydrogen, which is then combined with nitrogen for ammonia, or with captured CO2 for methanol. These e-fuels have the potential to be near zero emission on a life cycle basis.
But they come with their own challenges, I imagine. Infrastructure, cost, safety in some cases.
Oh, absolutely. Cost is a huge one right now. Production needs to scale up dramatically. And yes, handling ammonia safely requires specific procedures and technologies. Infrastructure for bunkering these new fuels needs to be built out globally.
Which leads us to another concept I've heard about. Green shipping corridors. What's the idea there?
Green corridors are basically specific, high-traffic shipping routes where governments and industry collaborate to accelerate the deployment of zero-emission fuels and technologies.
Kind of like test beds or first mover routes.
Exactly. The idea is to concentrate investment and policy support on these specific routes to create the necessary infrastructure, ensure fuel availability, and demonstrate the feasibility of zero-emission shipping. The Clybank Declaration, launched back at COP26, is driving this.
How many countries have signed up to that?
I think it's up to 27 now, including major players like the US, Canada, UK, Japan. Their goal was to establish at least 6 of these corridors by 2025.
Are we seeing any concrete examples emerge yet?
Yes, there are several proposals in development. One example is a potential corridor between South Korea and Europe, focusing specifically on using green methanol produced from renewable sources. Others are looking at routes across the Pacific or Atlantic.
It seems like a practical way to start tackling the problem-focused resources on specific routes first. But what's needed to make these corridors and the broader fuel transition actually happen on a large scale?
Well, as we touched on with the cost issue, national governments really need to play a significant role.
Also,
They need to help bridge that cost gap between cheap fossil fuels and these more expensive green alternatives, at least initially. That could mean subsidies, carbon contracts for difference, tax incentives, various policy tools.
financial support to de-risk the investment for shippers and fuel producers.
Precisely. And direct public investment in infrastructure ports ready to handle ammonia or methanol, renewable energy capacity to produce the e-fuels.
Yeah.
It requires a coordinated effort. And circling back to the equity point, ensuring developing countries aren't left behind is critical.
Right. Technical assistance, financial support for them too. Before we wrap up, are there other IMO initiatives we should be aware of that fit into this bigger picture of sustainable shipping?
Yeah, definitely. The IMO isn't just focused on fuels, they're also doing ongoing work on regulations for onboard carbon capture and storage.
CCS on ships. Interesting.
It is. It could be another potential pathway for decarbonization, especially for existing ships, perhaps. They also have a dedicated action plan to tackle marine plastic litter from ships.
So looking beyond just GHG emissions to other environmental impacts.
Exactly. Exactly. And crucially, underpinning all their climate work is a big focus on technical cooperation and capacity building. They have programs specifically aimed at helping developing countries, especially the least developed countries, LDCs, and small island developing states, SIDs, to implement these new regulations and participate in the transition.
That support piece sounds vital for making this global framework actually work globally.
It absolutely is. Without it, you risk creating a two-tiered system or leaving vulnerable nations behind, which undermines the whole effort.
So to sum up then, the IMO's net zero framework is a really major step. It sets clear goals for reducing GHG intensity and introduces economic drivers through carbon pricing, a powerful combination.
Definitely a landmark agreement for the sector.
But the massive challenge, the ongoing debate, revolves around what actually qualifies as a green or sustainable fuel. The biofuel controversy, with all its parallels to aviation and the EU's detailed rules, really highlights just how complex that definition is.
It does. Life cycle emissions, land use, feedstock sourcing, all these factors are going to be intensely scrutinized as the maritime world figures out its future fuel mix. And other options, like ammonia and methanol, have their own hurdles to overcome.
It's going to be fascinating and critical to watch how this unfolds.
Absolutely. The next few years are pivotal.
Thanks for joining us on ClinTech Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe and share this deep dive with anyone you know who's trying to navigate this intersection of climate policy and global commerce. Until next time, stay curious.
And maybe something for you, our listener, to think about. Considering everything we've discussed, the different GHG impacts of various biofuel pathways, the land use concerns, the controversy around crop-based fuels, what criteria do you think should be the absolute priority when we define a truly green fuel for shipping? And beyond just the definition, how can we ensure this massive global transition is genuinely fair and equitable for everyone involved?